I was just talking to Dana Lombardi upstairs in the ballroom, and he wanted me to remind everyone that we have a raffle he didn't tell me what kind of prizes, but I'm sure they're fantastic. So, what is that? World War I aircraft painting. Paintings. Let me introduce our next speaker, who is Dr. Graydon Turnstill, who's a senior lecturer of history at the University of South Florida, which I have to say is one of the centers of military history in the United States. As well as, it's interesting, by the way, that military history in the United States is not led by the big Ivy League Research One schools. Not by Princeton, not by Harvard, not by Columbia, not by Stanford. It's really led by the state universities. And, ourselves, Ohio State, University of South Florida, University of Southern Mississippi, and so on. Just saying. Right? So he teaches, he's also, by the way, on the National Executive, he's the National Executive Director for Phi Alpha Theta, which is the History Honor Society. We have a chapter here at San Jose State. Received his PhD from Rutgers in modern European history and published books and articles, including Blood in the Snow, the Carpathian Winter War of 1915, which I read a very good review of in the Journal of Military History.
Buy the book.
Yeah, buy the book, yes. Interesting quotes. Professor Turnstill won numerous superior teaching awards and lectured at the Sorbonne, University of Vienna, American colleges and universities, and World War I associations, and quite fortunately, us. So, without further ado, Dr. Turnstill.
You don't like to talk after lunch because you're not doing well, and neither is anybody else, but I'm going to talk about something you may not be aware of. And that's, there was a very interesting war. Can you hear me? Very interesting war on the Eastern Front. But air power on the Eastern Front was on a much smaller scale, obviously, than the Western. But the difference is the Western Front might be 350 miles, but the Eastern Front was 900 miles. And even with the Russian Air Force, they only had 244 planes when the war began. They couldn't cover the fronts to do reconnaissance, etc. But you also have more severe climatic conditions. The Russian winds coming out in the wintertime. In the book I wrote in the Carpathian Winter War, it's 40 below zero, you're in the Carpathian Mountains, and they couldn't get the airplane engines to turn over, let alone machine guns to fire, etc., etc. But there were very few aircraft deployed on the Eastern Front compared to the Western. The terrain difficulties and weather conditions inhibited movement as well of any air units. Now, you picture the airplane as this new technological development. Now let's go from the Western Front to the Eastern Front. How did you get the airplanes to the deployment area? On the back of horses and oxen and in wagons. The infrastructure in the Eastern Front, the roads were terrible. In the spring and fall, they were mud. In the winter, the snow covered the movements. So you had very slow movement. And what I'm going to do that's different from all the stuff on air power is to tie it into actual ground battle. Because two of the major offensives, the greatest Entente offensive at Brusilov, the Brusilov offensive in 1916, and the Gorlice-Tarnov offensive, were very greatly affected by air power, the use or not use. To the advantage of the Central Powers, Germany and Austria-Hungary, there were very few Russian airplanes. So they were the Germans did not take them seriously, so they could concentrate their air power on the Western Front. And so immediately, what the Germans did, and the Austro-Hungarians, was to use planes for reconnaissance missions. And what they did, if you had a unit on the Western Front that had been really blasted away, they would be sent to the Eastern Front to relax and to rehabilitate. The problem was, if they were there 6 months and went back to the Western Front, they were at a disadvantage flying against the Entente powers because of what had transpired in between. But the Eastern Front also served as a laboratory for air warfare, and inevitably it was not the best airplanes that would be sent there. And one of the key things, again, is the infrastructure. Very few railroads. The Brusilov offensive has to stop because there are not railroads to continue sending supplies. Gorlitsa Tarnov has to be stopped because they're not railroads. So it was very difficult to move units back and forth. Now I'm going to go into detail about technological advantages, etc. But you have to picture the Austro-Hungarian monarchy was at a major disadvantage in the war. The Hungarians had voted down military budgets for decades, so the Austrians entered the war with 45 airplanes, of which 15 were naval, but they were also obsolete. An interesting thing that many people don't realize is the Eastern Front is the only front where you had an actual battle in which the Navy, the Air Force, and the land forces cooperated. And that was the Germans at the Battle of Riga, R-I-G-A, which is one of the places where the stormtrooper tactics were worked out for the spring 1918 offensives on the Western Front. But I also want to point out something else. It's about December 1914-15 that you start using photography and wireless radios. Now, the radios were too heavy to be on airplanes, so you could not talk to the plane and the plane talk back. So when the pilots or the recon people got the information, they would let loose pigeons when they got close to the ground. They would wrap notes in rocks and drop them, or they'd land by the artillery units and say, this is where everything is. But air power played a more significant role as the war continued on the Eastern Front. And one of the keys, as I'm sure you're aware, is a much greater chance of maneuverability on the Eastern Front. Once you had the race to the sea and the Battle of Ypres, it's basically trench warfare. But the problem that a lot of people don't realize is a key to battle on the Western and Eastern and Italian fronts and Balkan front is that airplanes could preclude an offensive by catching on something's going to happen. For example, the Battle of the Somme, the Germans already knew in February because of the recon flights that the British were going to launch an offensive. And as I'll mention with Verdun, the key to the German success at first is they drove the French planes out of the skies so they could direct their artillery fire, etc. So you have more mobility on the Eastern Front. Now, here's one of the keys to understand the Eastern Front. 1914, it's industrial and economic development that is going to determine who are the major producers of weapons, including airplanes. Russia, Austria-Hungary, and Italy, to a lesser extent, were hampered by their inability to establish industrial bases to provide the capacity for the growth of air power. That meant the construction of airplanes and airplane engines. Thus, the lack of technology explains much of what happens on the Eastern Front in the air war as well as on the ground. As mentioned earlier, no one in 1914 believed that air power would be a decisive factor in battle. But almost immediately on the Eastern Front, they become very important. But something else, I always tell my students, you can't just look at the Western Front. You've got to tie everything together. When you're studying air power in the Eastern Front, there are two blockades that are critical to understand. The Entente blockade of Britain, which inhibits raw materials to Germany, which is to her disadvantage throughout the war on the ground, but with the construction of her airplanes.